The air in the Alabama Bayou doesn't just hang, it clings. It is a thick, suffocating shroud of humidity and the stench of brackish water, rotting peat, and the metallic tang of drying shrimp scales. At 3:42 a.m., the world is supposed to be silent, but the swamp is never truly quiet. It breathes, it crawls, it waits. In the darkness of the Bayou Black, the water is the color of used motor oil. Black, viscous, and reflecting nothing but the pale, sickly glow of a waning gibbous moon. The only mechanical sound is the rhythmic slap, slap, slap of the tide against the rotted cypress pylons of a nameless pier. This is where the world of men ends and the world of the ancient, primordial mud begins. Suddenly, the stillness is violated. Not by a scream, but by the heavy, wet thud of a body hitting the deck of a flat-bottomed skiff. Thump. It is the sound of meat hitting wood. Elijah Bo Jenkins stands over the shape, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged, wheezing gasps that whistle through a nose broken too many times in dockside brawls. His hands, calloused like the hide of an alligator and stained permanently with the grease of 1,000 outboard motors, are trembling. He isn't trembling from fear. Fear left him somewhere near Da Nang in '69. He is trembling from the sheer, adrenaline-fueled weight of what has just been done. He looks down at the man at his feet. In the weak moonlight, the victim's face is a mask of crimson and mud. This wasn't a clean death. It was a struggle born of years of resentment, of stolen crab traps, and of a family name dragged through the dirt. The blood looks black in this light, oozing slowly from a jagged wound in the temple where the heavy brass handle of a boat gaff made contact. Bo reaches for a heavy cinder block, already tied to a length of rusted rebar wire. The wire bites into his palms, but he doesn't flinch. He works with the methodical slowness of a man performing a chore he has done 1,000 times, like gutting a redfish or mending a net. He loops the wire around the ankles of the man who, only an hour ago, was shouting threats in the parking lot of the Rusty Anchor. With a grunt that sounds more like a growl, Bo heaves the weight over the side. For a split second, the body teeters on the gunwale, a grotesque silhouette against the misty horizon. Then, gravity takes its due. Splash! The water swallows the secret greedily. Bubbles rise to the surface, small, frantic pockets of air that pop with a sound like a quiet laugh. Within seconds, the surface is flat again. The ripples spread outward, hitting the stalks of the tall marsh grass, whispering through the reeds, as if telling the mud that another debt has been paid in full. Bo reaches for a tattered rag and wipes his hands, but the blood has already found its way into the deep cracks of his skin. He stares at the spot where the man vanished. He knows that in the bayou, nothing stays buried forever. The gators might find him, or the shifting silt might hide him, but the memory is now etched into the salt-crusted wood of the boat. He reaches into his pocket, pulls out a crumbled pack of unfiltered Camels, and strikes a match. The flame illuminates his face for a fleeting second, lines as deep as canyons, eyes like gold flint, and a jaw set in a permanent grimace of defiance. He exhales a cloud of gray smoke into the humid night. The war for the water has officially begun, and in Alabama, when a feud starts with blood, it usually ends with a massacre. The camera pans back slowly, showing the vastness of the dark swamp, the flickering light of Bo's cigarette, the only spark of life in a landscape defined by death and ancient unspoken laws.
To understand the violence of the Alabama coast in 1981, one must first understand the smell. It is not the clean salt spray scent of a vacation postcard. It is the heavy, suffocating stench of industrial decay mixed with the biological graveyard of the Gulf. It is the smell of 10,000 crushed shrimp heads rotting in the midday sun, of diesel fuel leaking from cracked rubber hoses, and of the sulfuric mud that turns the water the color of weak coffee. The town of Bayou Labache doesn't welcome outsiders. It merely tolerates them as long as they stay on the paved roads. But down by the docks, where the asphalt crumbles into oyster shells and dirt, The rules of the mainland don't apply. This is a landscape of rusted iron and weathered oak. Row after row of shrimp boats, vessels like the Miss Clara and the Southern Cross, sit tied to the barnacle-encrusted pilings. These aren't the gleaming white yachts of the Florida Keys. These are workhorses, their hulls scarred by collisions with submerged logs, their white paint peeling away like sunburned skin to reveal the gray, salt-eaten wood beneath. Massive steel outriggers hang over the sides like the skeletal limbs of prehistoric birds, draped in heavy green nylon netting that looks like giant spider webs drying in the humid air. Everywhere you look, there is mechanical entropy. Abandoned winch motors sit in the tall weeds, bleeding rust into the soil. Old tractor tires, used as boat fenders, hang limp from the piers. The sound of the port is a dissonant symphony, the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of a faulty generator, the screech of gulls fighting over a discarded fish carcass, and the low, guttural thrum of a Detroit diesel engine idling in the distance. The economy of the Gulf is a cruel mistress. By 1981, the gold rush of the 70s had vanished. Fuel prices were climbing like a fever, and the price of shrimp was falling. The men who walked these docks, men with skin the texture of old leather and eyes clouded by cataracts and cheap whiskey, felt the walls closing in. Every gallon of fuel was a gamble. Every empty net was a step closer to losing the house. In the local general stores, the air is thick with more than just humidity. It's thick with resentment. You see it in the way the local men lean against their rusted Chevy pickups, their caps pulled low, watching any car with an out-of-state license plate. They watch the newcomers, the corporations, and the migrant fleets with a silent, simmering fury. To these locals, the water wasn't just a resource, it was their birthright, an inheritance signed in the sweat of their grandfathers. The sun here doesn't shine, it beats down. It creates a heat haze that makes the horizon shimmer, turning the distant pine trees into ghostly apparitions. By noon, the shadows are harsh and black, hiding the faces of the men working on the decks. You can't tell if a man is smiling or snarling until you're close enough to feel his breath. This is a place where the law is a distant suggestion, usually represented by a lone sheriff's deputy who knows better than to ask questions about why a certain boat came in late or why a certain person hasn't been seen at the Sunday market. In the ports of Alabama, silence is the only currency that never devalues. The rot isn't just in the wood of the piers, it's in the hearts of men who have been pushed to the edge of the map, clutching their harpoons and their grudges, waiting for the spark that will set the whole humid world on fire.
The sun has not yet broken the horizon, but Elijah Bo Jenkins is already a ghost haunting his own deck. He stands amidst the coils of salt-stiffened rope, a man carved from the very oak and iron he commands. His face is a roadmap of a hard southern life, deep, jagged furrows etched into his brow like the tide lines in the mud, and skin the color of stained mahogany, cured by 40 years of unrelenting Gulf sun and stinging salt spray. Bo doesn't move with the agility of youth, but with a heavy, deliberate permanence. Every motion is a testament to survival. His hands tell the real story. The knuckles are swollen and scarred, the fingernails permanently blackened by engine grease and the brine of a million shrimp. When he grips a cigarette, his fingers look like the gnarled roots of a cypress tree clutching the earth. He wears a faded, sweat-stained flannel shirt with the sleeves hacked off at the shoulders, revealing forearms corded with muscle and a faded Navy tattoo from a war that never truly ended for him. There is a coldness in his eyes, not the coldness of malice, but the empty, haunting stare of a man who has seen the bottom of the ocean and the dark side of his own soul. He is the third generation of Jenkins men to bleed for these waters, and he carries the weight of that lineage like a lead sinker tied around his neck as he exhales a plume of gray smoke into the damp morning air. He isn't looking at the beauty of the dawn. He is looking at the horizon, searching for the silhouettes of the ships that don't belong here. He is a man who knows that his world is shrinking, and a cornered animal is at its most dangerous. To Bo, the water isn't just a living, it is his altar, and he is prepared to perform a sacrifice to keep it.
The conflict didn't start with a gunshot. It started with the hum of an engine that sounded too clean, too expensive, and too arrogant. Bo stands at the helm of the Sadie Mae, squinting through a cracked windshield smeared with salt. 100 yards to his port side, a sleek, modern trawler, steel-hulled and painted a blinding, disrespectful white, cuts through the water, its wake tossing Bo's wooden boat like a toy. These are the interlopers. Backed by corporate money from the city, they don't respect the unspoken boundaries that have governed these waters since the Great Depression. They drop their heavy, industrial-sized nets directly over the traditional crab lines of the local families, dragging the bottom clean and leaving nothing but silt and broken traps in their wake. The air on the deck is thick with more than just the midday heat. It's thick with a simmering, electric tension. Bo watches through binoculars as the crew of the white ship laughs, hauling up a net overflowing with the pink gold that should have been his. One of the men on the rival deck catches Bo's gaze and mockingly raises a beer can. It is a silent declaration of war. In the Bayou, a man's territory is his dignity. To steal a man's catch is to starve his children. Bo feels the familiar, hot itch in his palms, the need to reach for the Winchester kept under the pilot seat. He watches as his own colorful buoy markers, hand-painted with the Jenkins family colors, are sucked into the massive propellers of the corporate ship, shredded into plastic confetti. The line has been crossed, not just in the water, but in the blood. The peace of the coast is officially dead, replaced by a cold, calculating hunger for retribution.
The interior of the Black Anchor is a tomb of cedar and cigarette smoke. Low-hanging beams, stained dark by decades of tobacco and grease, seem to press down on the men gathered inside. The only light comes from a flickering neon Budweiser sign and the orange embers of dozens of cigarettes glowing in the gloom like malevolent fireflies. There is no music tonight. Only the low, rhythmic thrum of the ceiling fan and the heavy, gravelly mumble of desperate men. Bo sits at the far end of the scarred oak bar, his large frame casting a shadow that stretches across the floor. Around him are the others, the Miller brothers, old Salty Mike and young Silas, whose family lost their boat to the bank just last week. They don't look like men out for a drink. They look like a jury ready to deliver a hanging verdict. The air is stagnant, smelling of sour beer, wet wool, and the metallic tang of unspoken anger. Every time the heavy wooden door creaks open, the room goes silent, eyes darting to the entrance with a predator's instinct. They talk in circles about the white ships, their voices low and jagged like broken glass. They speak of heritage being trampled by polished leather shoes from the city. Here, in the shadows, the law of the land feels like a fairy tale. The only law that matters is the one written in the mud and the salt. One by one, they finish their shots of cheap bourbon, and the silence that follows is heavier than any threat ever shouted.
The escalation comes not with words, but with the roar of fire. Bo is jolted awake in his small shack by a sound like a rushing wind, a terrifying, hungry crackle. He lunges for the window to see the night sky turned a sickening, bruised orange. His equipment shed, housing the nets and the spare boat engines his father left him, is a towering pillar of flame. He runs outside, the heat hitting his face like a physical blow, his boots crunching on the dry grass. In the flickering light, he catches a glimpse of a dark truck speeding away down the dirt track, its headlights off, disappearing into the wall of pine trees. The smell of gasoline hangs thick in the air, overpowering the scent of the tide. Bo stands paralyzed for a moment, the fire reflecting in his wide, unblinking eyes. This was his life, the meticulously mended nets, the specialized tools, the history of his trade, all turning to ash in a matter of minutes. As the roof of the shed collapses in a shower of sparks, Bo doesn't cry out, doesn't call the fire department. He simply turns his back on the flames and walks towards his house, his shadow long and terrifying against the burning wood. He reaches for the heavy locker under his bed. Time for talking ended when the first match was struck. Now,
Bayou would demand payment in kind.
The air inside the garage is cold and smells of Hoppy's #9 gun oil and old sawdust. A single bare light bulb hangs from a frayed wire, swaying slightly in the draft, casting long, rhythmic shadows that dance across the walls. Bo Jenkins sits at a workbench littered with rusted bolts and sea salt corroded wrenches. He is not working on an engine tonight. Before him lies a disassembled Winchester Model 12 shotgun, its steel receiver glinting dully under the yellow light. The only sound is the rhythmic clack, slide, clack of the action being tested. Around the bench stand 4 other men, ghosts of the Bayou with hollow eyes and mouths set in grim lines. There is no conversation. Words are a luxury they can no longer afford. One man methodically loads red plastic shells into a leather bandolier, his fingers moving with a slow, hypnotic precision. Another sharpens a long, curved filleting knife on a whetstone. The shh, shh sound filling the gaps between their heavy breaths. They are shedding their identities as fishermen and becoming something older, something more primitive. They are preparing for a harvest, but not of shrimp. Bo picks up a heavy brass shell, wipes a smudge of oil from the casing, and slides it into the magazine. The sound of the spring compressing is the only contract they need. They aren't looking for justice. They are looking for a balance of scales that can only be settled in the dark.
3 flat-bottomed skiffs glide through the water like predatory shadows. There are no running lights, no glowing dials, no hum of a powerful motor. The men use long wooden poles to push through the shallow, weed-choked channels, avoiding the main waterway where the patrol boats might roam. The mist is so thick it feels like wet wool against their skin, muffling the sound of the water rippling against the hulls. Bo stands in the lead boat, his silhouette tall and motionless. The only light comes from the pale, sickly moon reflecting off the surface of the swamp, turning the water into a sheet of hammered silver. To their left and right, the gnarled roots of ancient cypress trees rise out of the mud like the rib cages of forgotten giants. The swamp is eerily quiet. Even the bullfrogs have stopped their croaking, as if sensing the predatory intent drifting through their domain. Ahead, the flickering glow of a campfire appears through the trees. It's the temporary camp of the interlopers, set up on a small island of high ground near the disputed oyster beds. The scent of wood smoke and expensive tobacco drifts across the water, a foreign intrusion in this wild place. Bo raises a hand, and behind him, the other 2 boats fan out, encircling the glow. They move with the deadly patience of hunters who have spent their lives waiting for the perfect strike. The trap is set, and the humidity seems to hold its breath.
The violence erupts not with a shout, but with the shattering of glass. A kerosene lantern on the camp's edge is the first to go, plunged into darkness by a single precise shot. Then the night belongs to the thunder. The heavy guttural roar of Bo's Winchester tears through the humid air, followed immediately by the sharp rhythmic cracks of the Miller brothers' hunting rifles. In the camp, chaos is instantaneous and blind. Men stumble out of nylon tents, their eyes wide with sleep and terror, only to be met by flashes of orange light from the tree line. There is no cover. There is only the tall grass and the unforgiving mud. The sound of the massacre is a cacophony of wet thuds, the metallic shriek of lead hitting boat hulls, and the desperate, gurgling cries of men who realized too late that they were not in the city anymore. Bo moves through the smoke like a vengeful spirit, his face illuminated in brief strobe-like bursts by the muzzle flashes. He doesn't aim with hesitation. He fires with the cold efficiency of a man clearing brush. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder replaces the scent of the swamp. For 6 minutes, the bayou screams. When the hammers finally click on empty chambers, the only sound left is the hiss of a dying fire and the rhythmic dripping of blood from the wooden pier into the black water below. 8 men lay still in the mud, their ambitions buried in the Alabama silt.
The dawn arrives with a sickly, pale light that offers no warmth. A low, creeping fog rolls over the island, partially veiling the carnage of the night. The water around the camp has turned a muddy, bruised purple. The sleek white trawler, once a symbol of corporate power, now sits riddled with holes, its pristine paint charred and splattered with gore. Spent brass casings litter the ground like metallic seeds that will never grow. Bo Jenkins stands on the shoreline, his shotgun broken open over his arm. He watches as the tide begins to come in, the salt water reaching up to lick the boots of the fallen. His clothes are soaked with dew and something darker. There is no triumph on his face, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. He looks at his hands and sees the dirt of the bayou under his fingernails, now mixed with the lifeblood of his enemies. He knows the cycle has been completed. He has defended his water, but at a price that can never be repaid. The fog begins to swallow the silhouettes of the bodies, and for a moment it looks as if the swamp itself is digesting the evidence of the crime. The silence of the morning is absolute. Even the gulls are absent, as if the island has been cursed by the night's work.
The investigation didn't end with handcuffs. It ended with a wall of silence as thick as the Alabama mud. Sheriff Miller, a man whose family had lived in the county for 5 generations, sits across from Bo Jenkins in a room that smells of stale coffee and old paper. A single fan whirs overhead, cutting through the stagnant heat, but it does nothing to clear the tension. On the table lies a folder of grainy crime scene photos, empty tents, blood-stained reeds, and the hollowed-out remains of a corporate dream. The sheriff knows. The whole town knows. They saw the smoke. They heard the echoes of the Winchester echoing across the water. But when the state investigators arrived, the bayou went mute. Engines were scrubbed clean with lye. Blood-soaked flannel was burned in backyard barrels. The witnesses, the waitresses at the diner, the mechanics at the docks, all developed a sudden, collective amnesia. Nobody saw a boat leave the dock that night, Bo, the sheriff says, his voice a low, tired rumble. He doesn't look at the suspect. He looks out the window at the distant tree line. In this part of the world, the law of the state is a thin veneer over the law of the blood. Without a body, most of which were weighted with cinder blocks and dropped into the deepest trenches of the Delta, there is no crime. The case is filed under missing persons, a file that will grow yellow and brittle in a metal cabinet, protected by the ironclad omerta of the fishing families.
40 years have passed, and the bayou has done what it does best. It has reclaimed its own. The Sadie Mae is long gone, her wooden ribs resting somewhere in the silt, a nursery for blue crabs and silt-dwelling eels. The dock where Bo Jenkins once stood is now nothing but a few jagged, moss-covered pylons sticking out of the water like rotted teeth. Nature has no memory of the massacre. It only knows the slow, persistent crawl of the tide. Occasionally, a young fisherman will find a rusted brass casing buried in the mud, or a piece of white-painted steel caught in a net. But they don't know the story. They don't know about the night the water turned red. The families who carried out the raid moved on or died out, taking their secrets to the local cemetery, where the salt air eats the names off the headstones. Bo Jenkins lived out his days in the silence he fought for, a man who saved his way of life by sacrificing his soul. The corporate ships eventually stopped coming, scared away by the curse of the Bayou Black. Today, the water is calm, the mist is thick, and the only sound is the wind whistling through the cypress knees. The bayou remembers the blood, but it will never tell. Some debts are so deep that only the mud can hold them.
The victory was hollow, and it began to rot inside Bo Jenkins long before the first winter frost hit the marshes. In the dead of night, the silence of his house became louder than any gunshot. Bo sits at a scarred linoleum table, the only light coming from the open door of a humming refrigerator. In front of him is a bottle of cheap rye and a stack of unpaid bills, but his eyes are fixed on his hands. No matter how hard he scrubs them with lye soap and stiff brushes, he can still smell the metallic tang of Pelican Island in his pores. He begins to see them in the shadows of his room, the faces of the men who never saw him coming. They aren't vengeful ghosts. They are simply there, standing in the corners of his vision, dripping swamp water onto his floor. His wife, Sarah, sleeps in the other room, oblivious to the fact that the man she married died on that island, replaced by a shell of a human, held together by secrets and whiskey. Every time a car slows down on the gravel road outside, his hand instinctively reaches for the ghost of a shotgun that isn't there. He saved the water, but he lost the ability to sleep in the dark. The gold of the Bayou has turned into lead in his chest, pulling him down into the same mud where he left his enemies.
A year later, the atmosphere in the town has shifted from tension to a cold, stagnant dread. The interlopers are gone, but so is the soul of the community. The local economy didn't bounce back. Instead, it curdled. Fear of the curse and the heavy presence of state investigators who lingered for months drove away the legitimate buyers. The docks are quiet, but it's the quiet of a graveyard. Men who used to laugh and trade stories over crates of iced shrimp now pass each other on the street without making eye contact. The omerta that protected Bo and his crew has become a prison. Families are divided. Those who weren't involved look at those who were with a mixture of terror and disgust. The local church, once the heart of the Bayou, stands nearly empty on Sundays because the preacher's sermons on "Thou shalt not kill" feel too much like an indictment. The victory in the water war didn't bring prosperity. It brought a slow, grinding decay. Shop windows are boarded up with plywood, and the only thing that grows in Coden anymore is the resentment of a generation that realized they traded their neighbors' lives for a dying industry.
14 years after the massacre, Bo Jenkins makes one last trip into the heart of the Bayou Black. He is an old man now, his lungs heavy with the damp air, and his heart failing him. He steers his small skiff to the exact spot near Pelican Island, where the water is deepest and the currents are most treacherous. He stops the engine and lets the boat drift into the tall, golden marsh grass. From a burlap sack, he pulls out the Winchester Model 12, the instrument of his justice. It is pitted with rust and salt, the wood swollen from the humidity. He doesn't say a prayer. He simply looks at the weapon for a long time, acknowledging it as the thing that defined his life and destroyed his peace. With a final shaking effort, he heaves the heavy steel over the side. It disappears into the black water with a dull, final thud, sinking into the silt alongside the bones of the men it killed. Bo knows that the truth will never come out in a courtroom, but the Bayou has already extracted its sentence. He sits in the drifting boat, watching the sun set over the horizon, realizing that the water didn't belong to him, or the corporations, or anyone else. It belonged to itself. As the shadows stretch across the Alabama coast, Bo Jenkins finally closes his eyes, a forgotten soldier of a forgotten war, leaving nothing behind but a legacy of blood that the tide will eventually wash clean.
To understand the sheer magnitude of the 1981 massacre, one must look far beyond the humidity of that Alabama summer. One must travel back, layer by layer, through the soil of time, to an era where the law. To understand the sheer magnitude of the 1981 massacre, one must look far beyond the humidity of that Alabama summer. One must travel back, layer by layer, through the soil of time, to an era where the law was a distant rumor and the shotgun was the only judge. The hatred between the Miller and Kane families was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, burning fuse that had been sputtering for over 100 years. It was a generational rot, a poison passed down from father to son like a grim inheritance. In the late 19th century, this land was a frontier, a place where survival was tied to every acre of pine and every head of cattle. The original dispute, long forgotten by the men who pulled the triggers in 1981, reportedly began over a simple property line marked by a crooked oak tree and a stray bull. But in the isolation of the bayou, a small slight becomes a wound, and a wound becomes a blood feud. By the turn of the century, the Millers and the Kanes had created a parallel society. They shared the same air, the same water, and the same language, but they lived in two different realities. Children were raised on stories of the other family's sins. At the dinner table, instead of grace, young Miller boys heard tales of how the Kanes had cheated their grandfather during the Great Depression. Across the creek, the Kane children were taught that a Miller's handshake was as hollow as a rotted log. This was a psychological fortification. By the time Silas Miller took control of the family business in the late 70s, the Kanes weren't seen as neighbors or even as human beings. They were obstacles. They were a historical error that needed to be corrected. The 1981 massacre was the final bloody punctuation mark at the end of a century-long sentence. It was the moment when the accumulated bitterness of 4 generations finally outweighed the value of human life. When the guns were fired, they weren't just killing men. They were trying to kill a history that had haunted them for 100 years.
The recovery of the evidence from the sunken shrimp boat was not a task for the faint of heart. It was a descent into a literal and figurative underworld. The Alabama Bureau of Investigation faced a forensic nightmare that would last for months. Imagine the conditions. The water in the bayou is not clear. It is a thick, tea-colored soup of tannins, silt, and decaying organic matter. Divers from the state team described it as working in a sensory deprivation tank. They couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. They had to navigate the interior of the sunken trawler by touch alone, their fingers brushing against jagged, rusted metal and the bloated, waterlogged remains of the victims. Every movement stirred up clouds of sediment that turned the crime scene into a black void. This was 1981. There were no digital scanners, no high-definition sonar, and DNA profiling was still a decade away from being a reliable tool. The investigators had to rely on the old ways, meticulous, exhausting physical labor. Each body had to be brought to the surface with extreme care, as the months in the water had made the remains incredibly fragile. But the bodies were only part of the puzzle. The true challenge lay in the ballistic evidence. The killers had been clever, or so they thought. They believed that by sinking the weapons and the victims in the deepest part of the bayou, the sulfuric environment and the shifting mud would erase the mechanical fingerprints of their crimes. They were wrong. Forensic technicians spent thousands of hours in poorly lit basement labs, cleaning silt from lead slugs and matching the microscopic striations to the rifles seized from the Miller farm. They had to prove that a specific firing pin struck a specific primer in the middle of a rain-soaked night. It was a game of microscopic shadows, where the difference between a life sentence and an acquittal rested on a fraction of a millimeter. This scene in the lab was as tense as any standoff in the woods. It was a battle of science against the silence of the swamp.
In the deep south of the early 1980s, the badge didn't always represent the law. Sometimes it represented the hierarchy. To talk about the Miller massacre without talking about Sheriff Big Jim Garrison is to tell only half the story. The sheriff's office was the invisible hand that guided the events leading up to that fatal night. Garrison wasn't just a lawman, he was the political architect of the county. He understood that in a place like Bayou La Batre, power isn't granted by the state, it's maintained through a complex web of favors, debts, and intimidation. The Millers were his inner circle. They provided the votes, the muscle, and the illicit funding that kept his machine running. In exchange, the sheriff provided them with something far more valuable: immunity. For months after the disappearances, Garrison played a calculated game of deception. When the wives of the Kane family came to his office, tears in their eyes, begging for a search party, he would lean back in his leather chair, light a cigarette, and tell them that their husbands had likely gone on a bender or headed to the oil rigs in Texas for better pay. He systematically dismantled the early investigation from the inside. He made sure the deputies didn't patrol near the old sawmill. He misplaced early reports of gunfire heard on the night of April 12th. This wasn't just negligence, it was a tactical defense of a criminal enterprise. The rot was systemic. It reached into the local prosecutor's office and whispered in the ears of the county judges. The silence of the town wasn't just born of fear, it was born of the realization that there was no one to call.
The law was the enemy. When the State Bureau of Investigation finally bypassed Garrison and made their arrests, the shockwaves didn't just hit the Miller family, they shattered the very foundation of the county's power structure. The trial revealed that the massacre wasn't a private feud. It was the inevitable result of a society where the guardians of the peace had become the architects of the slaughter.
Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Blood Bayou massacre isn't the violence itself, but the chilling normalcy that followed it. Who were the men who pulled the triggers that rainy April night? Silas and Caleb Miller weren't monsters from a fairy tale. They were men who were well known in the community. They were fathers, cousins, and hard-working loggers. But psychological profiles conducted during the trial and later analyzed by criminal historians revealed a phenomenon known as shared psychosis, or folie à deux. Within the closed ecosystem of the Miller family, the hatred for the Kanes had become a fundamental truth, as undeniable as gravity. They had spent decades dehumanizing their rivals, to the point where the act of killing them felt no more significant than clearing a patch of diseased timber from their land. To Silas Miller, the architect of the ambush, this wasn't a crime of passion. It was a strategic necessity. He viewed himself not as a murderer, but as a protector of his family's legacy. The investigative records describe a haunting scene on the morning after the massacre. While the bodies of 8 men were settling into the silt of the bayou, the Miller brothers were seen at a local diner, calmly eating breakfast and discussing the price of lumber. There was no shaking of hands, no frantic whispers, no signs of a guilty conscience. They had returned to their lives with a terrifying ease, convinced that they had finally cleaned up the county. This moral void is what truly baffled the state investigators. During his long hours in the interrogation room, Caleb Miller didn't express remorse for the lives taken. Instead, he expressed profound irritation. He was angry that outsiders from the city were interfering in a local matter that had been settled. This total lack of empathy, the ability to go home, sit at a dinner table with their wives, and sleep soundly while a dozen children were waiting for fathers who would never return, is the darkest part of this story. It reveals a level of cold, calculated detachment that challenges our understanding of human nature. They didn't just kill their neighbors, they erased them from their reality, believing that if they sank the bodies deep enough, the truth would never float to the surface. But in the end, it wasn't the law that broke them. It was the weight of the silence they tried to impose on a town that was finally ready to scream.
4 decades have passed since the waters of the Alabama Bayou finally surrendered the secrets of the Miller and Kane families. On the surface, the world has moved on. The old shrimp boat has long since been broken down by the salt and the tide. The sawmill is nothing more than a skeletal ruin, swallowed by kudzu and the relentless creep of the forest. But in the South, the past is never truly buried. It just waits beneath the topsoil. The Blood Bayou massacre remains a permanent scar on the collective memory of this land. It is a story that mothers tell their children to keep them away from the dark water, a cautionary tale about where hatred leads when it is allowed to fester for a century. The legacy of 1981 is not found in the court records or the dusty evidence boxes. It is found in the empty chairs at family reunions and the quiet, heavy atmosphere that still hangs over certain parts of the county. The survivors of that era are mostly gone now, taking their final secrets to the grave. But the echoes of the gunshots still vibrate through the pines. Why did it happen? Was it truly about land? Or was it about the terrifying human capacity to justify the unthinkable in the name of family loyalty? The case remains a haunting reminder that justice is a fragile, hard-won thing. It reminds us that when we stop seeing our neighbors as human, open the door to a darkness that even the brightest summer sun cannot dispel. As the sun sets today over the quiet ripples of the bayou, the beauty of the Spanish moss and the song of the cicadas mask a terrible truth, that beneath this tranquility lies a history of iron, fire, and blood. Some memories are fatal. Some stories are meant to be warnings. And some secrets
are the only things the swamp will never truly digest. This has been Fatal Memories. Thank you for seeking the truth with us in the shadows. Until next time.